Hello, genealogists. It's Craig again with Just Genealogy. Today we're going to talk about Quakers and military service. So, by way of introduction, there are no records that specifically identify Quakers in military service, at least not early on. You don't see it in enlistment papers, you don't see it in compiled military service records, you don't see it in military pensions generally, unless it's clues are in affidavits, and you definitely don't see it in bounty land. Now, later on, when we begin to see more complex military service records, such as in World War I and World War II, you might be able to find that information there because of religious affiliation is collected. But in the early wars, you're just not going to find it. Basically, the military didn't care if you were a Quaker, unless you created problems for them because you were a Quaker. An example would be if you were drafted and really didn't want to be drafted. So this means that research in military records is not the first place that you're going to look to find out if a Quaker had military service. You may very well find the military service, but you won't be able to identify that the individual was a Quaker or not. And the truth of the matter is, most Quakers, especially in our early wars, are not going to be participants in any conflict. Yet some might join. Some might join in a combatant role as a soldier, sailor, or marine, or in non-combatant roles such as corpsmen or medics, and some may perform some civilian non-combat role, such as with the Red Cross. So the research paths for each of these types of participation are different. But the secret is, don't do the military research first. Well, what do you need to know? You need to know the full name of the individual, their age, so you can make it different from anybody else of the same name, their place of birth to do the same thing, their residence before, during, and after the conflict, and the name of their spouse. The same things that you're going to do in researching anyone in any war. It's not any different. My ancestor, Woodson Parsons, served in the 1st Virginia Regiment. The left-hand side is from the microfilm copy. The right-hand side is from fold. I much prefer fold 3 over the microfilm copy these days. There are no clues whatsoever in his compiled military service record, but there may be clues in some military records. For example, in the Pennsylvania Archives, here is Samuel Scott being fined for non-attendance at muster in 1779. You look for a pattern of this kind of behavior, and in fact, Samuel Scott had a pattern of behavior of being fined often for non-participation in muster. Now, there are times when he's not fined, so it's unclear to me whether he actually attended muster or not, but recognize this is inactive duty muster, inactive duty militia. In other words, he's not actually fighting kind of thing. But he does have a pattern in Bensalem Township of not attending muster and being fined for it. He's a member of the Bensalem monthly meeting and is a Quaker. And his father's doing the same thing. So again, look, here's a father and son connection. Neither one of them are mustering as they should, and they're being fined for it. So what am I going to do first? Well, I'm going to search on Ancestry in the catalog entry U.S. Hinshaw Index to Selected Quaker Records 1680 to 1940. So what I type in the title is Hinshaw, and only two things show up, one on Hinshaw families and the other on this Henshaw Index. So I'm going to go there, and then I'm going to see who shows up. And then I'm going to take that information and I'm going to refine it into further research within the Ancestry card catalog in records dealing with Quakers. So when I look at Hinshaw, I see a entry for Woodson Parsons, and I'll show it to you in a bit. And then I go and put Woodson Parsons' name into Quaker meeting records, and there are 7 entries for Woodson Parsons. And they are miscellaneous, and they are disownment. You want to look for words and abbreviations like denial, disowned, DIS, disownment, military service, or excused from military service, EXMS. Always look for more than one entry. There may be variations in spelling and that kind of stuff that you have to pay attention to. There should be several entries between the need for a denial and the concluding disowning. So look for those kind of things. See if there's an entry where the disowned member is in fact reunited with the community. This may be several years after the military service, and this happens a lot. Sometimes it takes 10 years for it to happen, but it does happen. You're going to need an abbreviation list. I have one. I don't know where I got it, so I really can't share it with you, but you can find in the Hinshaw Index on Ancestry under supplemental materials a set of index cards that will help you in figuring out what specific abbreviations might be. So when I go to Hinshaw, this is what I see for one of the entries for Woodson. In 1778, Woodson is disowned from military practices because he's reported that he has enlisted. Now, having found that in Hinshaw, I want to go to Ancestry and find the actual records. And these are from Ancestry, and unfortunately they're reverse photostats, but they in fact basically talk about Woodson Parsons being disowned because it's been reported that he is in the military. He actually doesn't get back in. He dies in 1797, and there's no evidence that he became a Quaker again. So if there is service and it appears that the member has military service in Quaker records, then look for the pensions and compiled military service records and the bounty land records that fit the geographic location of the service. Theoretically, you probably have already found this because you didn't start out with a guy being a Quaker. But if you started out with a guy being a Quaker, then you want to look anyway if you find a disownment or find out that he had military service in the records. The bottom line is that a Quaker who remained true to their pacifistic beliefs would refuse to support any military actions, but Quakers who did not remain true to those beliefs and did participate in military actions would suffer repercussions. So what you want to do is search for these repercussions in the records. During the Revolutionary War, approximately 1,700 Quakers were disowned because of service or support of the cause in the American Revolutionary War. There's a reason why Quakers are pacifistic, and you can obtain further information about this from the Quaker Peace Testimony. I've got a URL here, and I'll put this URL in the description so that you can get to it easily. So what were the expectations of the Quaker community? Well, they reject violence in all forms, publicly and privately, and they refuse to participate in any kind of military training or musters. They also refuse to pay the fines, penalties, and taxes for failing to participate in this training and the musters or any other personal service associated with the military. They also refuse to find a substitute for military service. And these kind of things would not only apply to them, but to their children, to their apprentices, and to their servants. So the Quaker response to the American Revolution was very pacifistic, and they avoided at all costs because they intended to follow their faith and stay totally out of the conflict. You will find that loyalists, they'll be identified as loyalists because they didn't support the cause, and many of them will end up moving to Canada or Great Britain. They could support the cause without joining the military, and they sort of did that underneath the table by providing some form of support. And there is also the possibility that they would actually join the military and suffer the consequences. There is created for those Quakers who believed in the principles of the Revolution but were expelled from the mainstream faith the concept of free Quakers. The Religious Society of Free Quakers, or as they were termed at the time, the Fighting Quakers, basically came into being. Over time, their numbers gradually diminished as members died off or they were accepted back into the mainstream Quaker community. Meetings were held at the Free Quaker Meeting House in Philadelphia until 1834. There also was a monthly meeting of Free Quakers in Sandwich, Massachusetts until about 1815. But by about 1834, it was no longer a thing. This is a picture of the Free Quaker Meeting House. There's a Wikipedia page for Free Quakers, and this is from that. It is on the Register of Historic Places, and this one is located in Philadelphia. So there are some manuscript collections that deal with this. Samuel Wetherill was the founder of the Free Quakers. He was disowned in 1779 for disunity. He remained in his own mind a Quaker. His correspondence from 1780 to 1816 is at Swarthmore College, and he was the clerk for a small group of disowned Quakers in Philadelphia. I'll put this link from Swarthmore also down in the description. There are other papers that deal with Free Quakers. There is a list of the Free Quaker Philadelphia members and further information at these URLs. I will put those down in the bottom also. Now, how did everybody else react to the Quakers who wouldn't serve? Well, some Quakers were detained by American authorities because their loyalty in not supporting the war was suspect. There's a book called Exiles in Virginia by Thomas Glippin that talks about the observations on the conduct of the Society of Friends during the Revolutionary War and what happened to them between 1777 and 1778. And this book is available from Heritage Books if you're interested in it. There are examples in the papers of the Continental Congress from the Board of War that can be found on Fold 3 that advised the Executive Council of Pennsylvania to remove 20 well-respected Philadelphia Quakers from Philadelphia because of the sense of their disloyalty. These folks were sent without a hearing to Stanton, Virginia for safekeeping. They only got as far as Winchester, Virginia, where they were detained for nearly 9 months. The Civil War experience is a little bit different because by the time of the Civil War, Quakers had become a little bit more liberal regarding military service. You still would expect that a Quaker wouldn't serve. However, the aversion to slavery was a major cause for enlistments in the Union Army by Quakers. And there also was the opportunity for a $300 commutation fee in 1862 that meant that Quakers didn't necessarily have to be drafted. My experience researching Loudoun County is that the Quakers in Waterford at the Fairfax Monthly Meeting and in Purcellville at Goose Creek, when the Confederate or the Union recruiters were wandering the county, these Quakers would leave town and go as far away as Ohio. And once word came to them that the recruiters were gone, they would come back. There are many letters written by Quaker soldiers during the war, and it appears that patriotism and preserving the Union were actually, for them, more important than their faith was. There also was the issue that prior to the Civil War, especially out of North Carolina, there was a general exodus of Quakers out of these slaveholding states and into the North and West, meaning largely Ohio. Quakers in Ohio created training for North Carolina farmers so they could learn how to farm in Ohio, which they basically didn't know how. But this was before the Civil War. There are a few books out there. Quaker Goes to War, The Diary of William Harvey Walter, and then Kimball Pearson's a Civil War cavalryman who was also a Quaker. And these books are also available from Heritage Books. Quaker participation in the Confederacy was lower because it was a slavery issue. Although it varied by state, it was possible to hire a substitute. For example, in North Carolina, the commutation fee in May of '62 was $100, but by '63 it had gone up to $500. In the South, the remaining Quakers hid from conscription details whenever possible, much like what I was talking about in Loudoun County, even going as far as to remove themselves to Union territory for periods of time. In 1864, there was some provision created by the Confederacy for non-combatant service, and a lot of Quakers took advantage of that because they largely had no choice. They would work, for example, in the salt works in Wilmington, North Carolina. The salt works employed about 250 men. And I'll put the blog post concerning that down at the bottom in the description. During the Civil War, there was a group of people called the Loyal Heroes of America, the Red Strings. This was a group of Southern Unionists who in 1863 favored peace, an end to the Confederacy, and a return to the Union. It was largely made up of Unionists, of course, and Quakers in the Piedmont of Virginia and North Carolina. They protected deserters, aided spies and escaped prisoners, and supplied information to Union forces. Some in the South joined the Quaker faith as a rejection of both war and slavery, and these folks were known as the War Quakers. They also were avoiding service. You may find Quakers as civilians in military records because, again, many of them would be detained by both federal or Confederate authorities, largely because of their perceived disloyalty, and basically they became prisoners of war. Many of them would end up in Capitol Prison. I'm going to talk about Amasa Huff. He's a Quaker living in Loudoun County. When you go out to Fold 3, you will find several things that you can find him in. One is Civil War subversion investigations. Many Quakers were investigated. And you'll also find him in the Southern Claims, both in barred and approved claims. So you want to look definitely in Civil War subversion investigations, and you definitely want to look in Southern Claims for Quakers. Now, there may not be anything in any of these things that specifically say they're Quakers in the Southern Claims, but there might be. Quakers, unlike other Unionists who suffered in the hands of the Union Army, could later claim under several different claim commissions. The Southern Claims Commission is the largest and the easiest one to get to. Barred claims means that there was proven Confederate sympathy. Disallowed claims means that there wasn't sufficient paperwork to support the claim, and allowed claims were claims that were actually accepted and were actually paid. And all three of these for the Southern Claims Commission are in Fold 3. Some of them are in separate states like Virginia, West Virginia, Alabama, and Georgia, and the rest are in a catch-all for all of the rest. And that all of these are on Fold 3 now. So when we look at Amasa Huff, he's living in Waterford, Virginia. That's the Fairfax Monthly Meeting. He has a claim, and you will find what I love about Southern Claims is note in the center it says testimony of. There's multiple people talking about what's going on and how they favored the Union and what happened to them because of the war, and it just goes on and on and on. Now, you may also find in records of the Provost Marshal in the Citizens File that Quakers end up in jail. Amasa Huff was arrested for running through our lines by the Provost Marshal, and because of that, he spent time in Old Capitol Prison. So this information is found in the Citizens File, which is on Fold 3. So we'll save after the Civil War for another day. I'll just say that Quakers become even more liberal about all this after the Civil War. But that's for another day. So this has been Just Genealogy, converting people doing genealogy into genealogists day by day. I appreciate you all. Please subscribe. Click that bell so you're notified when the next daily day comes out.